Theme 5. Through the eyes of travelers. Perceptions of society. 10th to 17th century. Pan lips. Women and men have traveled in search of work to escape from natural disasters. As traders, merchants, soldiers, priests, pilgrims, or driven by a sense of adventure. Those who visit or come to stay in a new land invariably encounter a world that is different in terms of the landscape or physical environment, as well as customs, languages, beliefs, and practices of people. Many of them try to adapt to these differences. Others, somewhat exceptional, note them carefully in accounts, generally recording what they find unusual or remarkable. Unfortunately, we have practically no account of travel left by women, though we know that they traveled. The accounts that survive are often varied in terms of their subject matter. Some deal with affairs of the court, while others are mainly focused on religious issues or architectural features and monuments. For example, one of the most important descriptions of the city of Vijayanagara in the 15th century comes from Abdul Razzaq Samarkandi. A diplomat who came visiting from Herat. In a few cases, traveler did not go to distant land. For example, in the Mughal Empire, administrators sometimes traveled within the empire and recorded their observations. Some of them were interested in looking at popular customs and the folklore and traditions of their own land. In this chapter, we shall see how our knowledge of the past can be enriched through a consideration of description of social life provided by travelers who visited the subcontinent, focusing on the accounts of three men: Al-Biruni, who came from Uzbekistan, 11th century; Ibn Battuta, who came from Morocco in northeastern Africa, 14th century; the Frenchman Francois Vernier, 17th century. The coconut and the palm were things that struck many travelers as unusual. Al-Biruni's objectives. Al-Biruni described his work as a help to those who want to discuss religious questions with them, the Hindus, and as a repository of information to those who want to associate with them. Read the excerpt from Al-Biruni sources 5 and discuss whether his work met these objectives. Comment this. As this author came from vastly different social and cultural environment, they were often more attentive to everyday activities and practices which were taken for granted by indigenous writers for whom these were routine matters, not worthy of being recorded. It is this difference in perspective that makes the accounts of travelers interesting. Who did these travelers write for? As we will see, the answers vary from one instance to the next. 1. Al-Biruni and the Kitabul Hind. From Khorizm to the Punjab. Al-Biruni was born 973 in Khorizm in present-day Uzbekistan. Khorizm was an important center of learning and Al-Biruni received the best education available at this time. He was well versed in several languages: Syriac, Arabic, Persian, Hebrew, and Sanskrit, although he did not know Greek. He was familiar with the works of Plato and other Greek philosophers, having read them in Arabic translation. In 1017, when Sultan Mahmud invaded Khorasan, he took several scholars and poets back to his capital, Ghazni. Al-Biruni was one of them. He arrived in Ghazni as a hostage, but gradually developed a liking for the city, where he spent the rest of his life until his death at the age of 70. Translating texts, sharing ideas. Al-Biruni's expertise in several languages allowed him to compare languages and translate texts. He translated several Sanskrit works, including Patanjali's works on grammar in Arabic. For his Brahmana friend, he translated the work of Euclid, a Greek mathematician, into Sanskrit. It was in Ghazni that Al-Biruni developed an interest in India. This was not unusual. Sanskrit works on astronomy, mathematics, and medicine had been translated into Arabic from the 8th century onwards, when the Punjab became a part of the Ghaznavid Empire. Contacts with the local population helped create an environment of mutual trust and understanding. Al-Biruni spent years in the company of Brahmana priests and scholars, learning Sanskrit and studying religious and philosophical texts. While his itinerary is not clear, it is likely that he travelled widely in Punjab and parts of northern India. Travel literature was already an accepted part of Arabic literature by the time he wrote. This literature dealt with lands as far apart as the Sahara Desert in the west to the river Volga in the north. So while few people in India would have read Al-Biruni before 1500, many others outside India may have done so. Metrology is the science of measurement. Hindu. The term Hindu was derived from an old Persian word used 6th-5th centuries BC to refer to the region east of the river Sindhu. Thus, the Arabs continued the Persian usage and called this region Al-Hind and its people Hindi. Later, the Turks referred to the people east of the Indus and Hindu, their land as Hindustan, and their language as Hindavi. None of these expressions indicated the religious identity of the people. It was much later that the term developed religious connotations. Discuss if Al-Biruni lived in the 21st century, which are the areas of the world where he could have been easily understood if he still knew the same languages. Come with this. The Kitab-ul-Hind. Al-Biruni's Kitab-ul-Hind, written in Arabic, in simple and lucid. It is a voluminous text divided into 80 chapters on subjects such as religion and philosophy, festival, astronomy, alchemy, manners and customs, social life, weights and measure, iconography, laws and metrology. Generally, though not always, Al-Biruni adopted a distinctive structure in each chapter, beginning with a question, following this up with a description based on Sanskritic tradition, and concluding with a comparison with other cultures. Some present-day scholars have argued that this almost geometric structure, remarkable for its precision and predictability owed much to his mathematical orientation. Al-Biruni, who wrote in Arabic, properly intended his work for people living along the frontiers of the subcontinent. He was familiar with translations and adaptations of Sanskrit, Pali and Prakrit texts into Arabic. This ranged from fables to works on astronomy and medicine. However, he was also critical about the ways in which these texts were written and clearly wanted to improve on them. If Al-Biruni lived in the 21st century, which are the areas of the world where he could have been easily understood if he still knew the same languages? Comment this. An illustration from a 13th century Arabic manuscript showing the Athenian statesman and poet Solon, who lived in the 6th century BC, addressing his students. Notice the clothes that are shown in. Are these clothes Greek or Arabian? Comment this. The bird leaves its nest. This is an excerpt from the Rila. My departure from Tangier, my birthplace, took place on Thursday. I set out alone, having neither fellow traveler nor caravan whose party I might join, but swayed by an overmastering impulse within me and a desire long cherished in my bosom to visit these illustrious sanctuaries. So I braced my resolution to quit all my dear ones, females and male, and forsook my home as birds forsake their nest. My age at the time was 22 years. Ibn Battuta returned home in 1354, about 30 years after he had set out. 2. Ibn Battuta's Rila, an early globetrotter. Ibn Battuta's book of travels called Rila, written in Arabic, provides extremely rich and interesting details about the social and cultural life in the subcontinent in the 14th century. This Moroccan traveler was born in Tangier into one of the most respectable and educated families known for their expertise in Islamic religious law or Sharia. True to the tradition of his family, Ibn Battuta received literary and scholastic education when he was quite young. Unlike most other members of his class, Ibn Battuta considered experience gained through travels to be a more important source of knowledge than books. He just loved traveling and went to far-off places, exploring new worlds and peoples. Before he set off for India in 1332 to 33, he had made pilgrimage trips to Mecca and had already traveled extensively in Syria, Iraq, Persia, Yemen, Oman, and a few trading ports on the coast of East Africa. Traveling overland through Central Asia, Ibn Battuta reached Sindh in 1333. He had heard about Muhammad bin Tughlaq, the Sultan of Delhi, and lured by his reputation as a generous patron of arts and letters, set off for Delhi, passing through Multan and Uch. The Sultan was impressed by his scholarship and appointed him the Qazi or judge of Delhi. He remained in the position for several years until he fell out of favor and was thrown into prison. Once the misunderstanding between him and the Sultan was cleared, he was restored to imperial services and was ordered in 1342 to proceed to China as the Sultan's envoy to the Mughal rulers. Robbers attacking travelers, a 16th century Mughal painting. How can you distinguish the travelers from the robbers? Comment this. With the new assignment, Ibn Battuta proceeded to the Malabar coast through Central Asia. From Malabar, he went to the Maldives, where he stayed for 18 months as the Qazi, but eventually decided to proceed to Sri Lanka. He then went back one more to the Malabar coast and the Maldives, and before resuming his mission to China, visited Bengal and Assam as well. He took a ship to Sumatra, and from there another ship for the Chinese port town of Jaitun, now known as Guangzhou. He traveled extensively in China, going as far as Beijing, but did not stay for long, deciding to return home in 1347. His account is often compared with that of Marco Polo, who visited China and also India from his home base in Venice in the late 13th century. A boat carrying passenger, terracotta sculpture from a temple in Bengal, 17th-18th centuries. Why do you think some of the passengers are carrying arms? Comment this. Ibn Battuta meticulously recorded his observations about new cultures, peoples, beliefs, values, etc. We need to bear in mind that this globetrotter was traveling in the 14th century, when it was much more arduous and hazardous to travel than it is today. According to Ibn Battuta, it took 40 days to travel from Multan to Delhi and about 50 days from Sindh to Delhi. The distance from Daulatabad to Delhi was covered in 40 days, while that from Gwalior to Delhi took 10 days. The lonely traveler. Robbers were not the only hazards on long journeys. The travelers could feel homesick or feel ill. Here is an excerpt from the Rila. I was attacked by the fever, and I actually tied myself on the saddle with a turban cloth in case I should fall off by reason of my weakness. So at last we reached the town of Tunis, and the townsfolk came out to welcome the Sheikh and the son of Qazi. On all sides, they came forward with greetings and questions to one another, but not a soul said a word of greetings to me. Since there was none of them I knew, I felt so sad at heart on account of my loneliness that I could not restrain the tears that started to my eyes, and wept bitterly. But one of the pilgrims, realizing the cause of my distress, came up to me with a greeting. Map 1. Places visited by Ibn Battuta in Afghanistan, Sindh, Punjab. Many of places' names have been spelled as Ibn Battuta would have known them. Antkhoe, Turmez, Balkh, Kunduz, Parvan, Kabul, Ghazna, Kandahar, Ajudahan, Abuhar, Saraswati, Hanshi, Sutlej, Delhi, Multan, Uja, Indus, Lahari, Arabian Sea. Use the scale on the map to calculate the distance in miles between Multan and Delhi. Comment this. Traveling as was also more insecure. Ibn Battuta was attacked by bands of robbers several times. In fact, he preferred traveling in a caravan along with companions, but this did not deter highway robbers. While traveling from Multan to Delhi, for instance, his caravan was attacked and many of his fellow travelers lost their lives. Those travelers who survived, including Ibn Battuta, were severely wounded. The enjoyment of curiosities. As we have seen, Ibn Battuta was an inveterate traveler who spent several years traveling through North Africa, West Asia, and parts of Central Asia. He may even have visited Russia, the Indian subcontinent, and China. Before returning to his native land, Morocco, when he returned, the local ruler issued instructions that his stories be recorded. Education and entertainment. This is what Ibn Jujay, who was deputed to write what Ibn Battuta dictated, said in his introduction. A gracious direction was transmitted by the ruler that he, Ibn Battuta, should dictate an account of the cities which he had seen in his travel and of the interesting event which had clung to his memory, and that he should speak of those whom he had met, of the rulers of countries, of theirs distinguished men of learning, and their pious saints. Accordingly, he dictated upon these subjects as narrative which gave entertainment to the mind and delight to the ears and eyes, with a variety of curious particulars, by the expositions of which he gave edification, and of marvelous things by referring to which he aroused interest. In the footsteps of Ibn Battuta, in the centuries between 1400 to 1800, visitors to India wrote a number of travelogues in Persian. At the same time, Indian visitors to Central Asia, Iran, and the Ottoman Empire also sometimes wrote about their experiences. These writers followed in the footsteps of Al-Biruni and Ibn Battuta, and had sometimes read these earlier authors. Among the best known of these writers were Abdul Razzaq Samarkandi, who visited South India in the 1440s, Mahmud Wali Balkhi, who travelled very widely in the 1620s, and Sheikh Ali Hajin, who came to North India in 1740s. Some of these authors were fascinated by India, and one of them, Mahmud Balkhi, even became a sort of Sannyashi for a time. Others, such as Hajin, were disappointed and even disgusted with India. Where they expected to receive a red carpet treatment, most of them saw India as a land of wonders. Discuss. Compare the objectives of Al-Biruni and Ibn Battuta in writing their accounts. Comment this. An 18th century painting depicting travelers gathered around a campfire. Three, Francis Barnier, a doctor with a difference. Once the Portuguese arrived in India in about 1500, a number of them wrote detailed accounts regarding Indian social custom and religious practices. A few of them, such as the Jesuit religious practices, a few of them, such as the Jesuit Roberto Nobili, even translated Indian text into European languages. Among the best known of Portuguese writers is Dortre Barbosa, who wrote a detailed account of trade and society in South India. Later, after 1600, we find growing numbers of Dutch, English, and French travelers coming to India. One of the most famous was the French jeweler Jean-Baptiste Travaillier, who traveled to India at least 6 times. He was particularly fascinated with the trading conditions in India and compared India to Iran and Ottoman Empire. Some of these travelers, like the Italian Dr. Manucchi, never returned to Europe and settled down in India. Francis Barnier, a Frenchman, was a doctor, political philosopher, and historian. Like many others, he came to Mughal empires in search of opportunities. He was in India for 12 years, from 1656 to 1668, and was closely associated with the Mughal court as a physician to Prince Darashok, the eldest son of Emperor Shah Jahan, and later as an intellectual and scientist, with Danishmand Khan, an Armenian noble at the Mughal court, comparing East and West. Barnier travelled to several parts of the country and wrote accounts of what he saw, frequently comparing what he saw in India with the situation in Europe. He dedicated his major writing to Louis XIV, the King of France, and many of his other works was written in the form of letter to influential official and minister. In virtually every instance, Barnier described what he saw in India as a bleak situation in comparison to developments in Europe. As we will see, this assessment was not always accurate. However, when his works were published, Barnier's writings became extremely popular. A 17th century painting depicting Barnier in European clothes. A painting depicting Travanier in Indian clothes. Traveling with the Mughal army. Barnier often travelled with the army. This is an excerpt from his description of the army's march to Kashmir. I am expected to keep 2 good Turkoman horses, and I also take with me a powerful Persian camel and driver, a groom for my horses, a cook and a servant to go before my horse with a flask of water in his hand, according to the custom of the country. I am also provided with every useful article, such as a tent of moderate size, a carpet, portable bed made of 4 very strong but light cans, a pillow, a mattress, round leather tablecloths used as meal, some few napkins of dyed clothes, 2 small bags with culinary utensils, which are all placed in a large bag, and this bag is again carried in a very capacious and strong double sack or net made of leather thongs. This double sack likewise contains the provisions, linens, and wearing apparel. Both the masters and servants I have taken care to lay in a stock of excellent rice for 5 or 6 days' consumption of sweet biscuit flavored with anise, a herb, of limes and sugar, nor have I forgotten a linen bag with a small iron hook for the purpose of suspending and draining dahi or curds, nothing being considered so depressing in this country as lemonade and dahi. What are the things from Barnier's life that you would take on a journey today? Comment this. The creations and circulations of ideas about India. The writings of European travelers helped produce an image of India for Europeans through the printing and circulations of their books. Later, after 1750, when Indians like Sheikh Itisamuddin and Mirza Abu Talib visited Europe and controlled his this image that Europeans had of their society, they tried to influence it by producing their own versions of matters. Burnier's works were published in France in 1670 to 71 and translated into English, Dutch, German, and Italian within the next 5 years. Between 1670 and 1725, his account was reprinted 8 times in French, and by 1684 it had been reprinted 3 times in English. This was in marked contrast to the accounts in Arabic and Persian, which circulated and manuscripts and were generally not published before 1800. Discuss. There is a very rich travel literature in Indian languages. Find out about travel writers in the languages you use at home. Read one such account and describe the areas visited by the traveler, what she or he saw, and why she or he wrote the account. Comment this. A language with an enormous range. Al-Biruni describes Sanskrit as follows. If you want to conquer this difficulty, that is, to learn Sanskrit, you will not find it easily. Because the language is of an enormous range, both in words and inflection, some things like the Arabic, calling one and the same thing by various names, both original and derivative, and using one and the same word for a variety of subjects, which in order to be properly understood must be distinguished from each other by various qualifying epithets. Making sense of an alien world, Al-Biruni and the Sanskritic tradition. Overcoming barriers to understanding. As we have seen, travelers often compared what they saw in the subcontinent with practices with which they were familiar. Each traveler adopted distinct strategies to understand what they observed. Al-Biruni, for instance, was aware of the problems inherent in the tasks he had set himself. He discussed several barriers that he felt obstructed understanding. The first among these was language. According to him, Sanskrit was so different from Arabic and Persian that ideas and concepts could not be easily translated from one language into another. The second barrier he identified was the difference in religious belief and practices. The self-absorption and consequent insularity of the local population, according to him, constituted the third barrier. Is interesting is that even though he was aware of these problems, Al-Biruni depended almost exclusively on the works of Brahmanas, often citing passages from the Vedas, the Puranas, the Bhagavad Gita, the works of Patanjali, the Manusmriti, etc. to provide an understanding of Indian society. God knows best. Travelers did not always believe what they were told. When faced with the story of a wooden idol that supposedly lasted for 2,16,432 years, Al-Biruni asks, how then would have lasted such a length of time, and particularly in a place where the air and the soil are rather wet? God knows best. Al-Biruni's description of the caste system. Al-Biruni tried to explain the caste system by looking for parallel in other societies. He noted that in ancient Persia, 4 social categories were recognized. Those of knights and princes, monks fire priests and lawyers, physicians, astronomers, and other scientists, and finally peasants and artisans. In other words, he attempted to suggest the social division were not unique in India. At the same time, he pointed out that within Islam, all men were considered equal, differing only in their observance of piety. In spite of his acceptance of the Brahmanical description of the caste system, Al-Biruni disapproved of the notion of pollution. He remarked that everything which falls into a state of impurity strives and succeeds in regaining its original condition of purity. The sun cleanses the air, and the salt in the sea prevents the water from becoming polluted. If it were not so, insisted Al-Biruni, life on earth would have been impossible. This conception of social pollution intrinsic to the caste system was, according to him, contrary to the laws of nature. The System of Burness. This is Al-Biruni's accounts of the System of Burness, the highest caste at the Brahmana, of whom the books of the Hindus tells us that they were created from the head of Brahman, and as the Brahman is only another name for the force and called nature, and the head in the highest parts of the body, and the Brahmana at the choice part of the whole genus. Therefore, the Hindus considered them as the very best of mankind. The next caste are the Kshatriyas, who was created, as they say, from the shoulder and hands of Brahman. Their degree is not much below that of Brahmana. After them follow the Vaishya, who were created from the thigh of Brahmana, the Shudra, who were created from his feet. Between the latter two classes there is no very great distance, much however, as these classes differ from each other. They live together in the same towns and villages, mixed together in the same houses and lodgings. Compared with Al-Biruni's road to source 6, chapter 3, do you notice any similarities and differences? Do you think Al-Biruni depended only on Sanskrit texts for his information and understanding of Indian society? Comment this. As we have seen, Al-Biruni's description of the caste system was deeply influenced by his study for normative Sanskrit texts which laid down the rules governing the system from the point of view of the Brahmanas. However, in real life the system was not quite as rigid. For instance, the categories defined as antajaja, literally born outside the system, were often expected to provide inexpensive labor to both peasant and jamindars. See also chapter 8. In other words, while they were often subjected to social oppressions, they were included within economic networks. Discuss how important is knowledge of the language of the area for a traveler from a different region. Five, Ibn Battuta and the excitement of the unfamiliar. By the time Ibn Battuta arrived in Delhi in the 14th century, the subcontinent was part of a global network of communications that stretched from China in the east to northwest Africa and Europe in the west. As we have seen, Ibn Battuta himself traveled extensively through these lands, visiting sacred shrines, spending time with learned men and rulers, often officiating as Qazi, and enjoying the cosmopolitan culture of urban center where people who spoke Arabic, Persian, Turkish and other languages shared ideas, information and anecdotes. This includes stories about men noted for their piety, kings who could be both cruel and generous, and above the lives of ordinary men and women. Anything that was unfamiliar was particularly highlighted in order to ensure that the listener or the reader was suitably impressed by account of distant yet accessible words. Nuts like a man's head. The following is how Ibn Battuta described the coconut. These trees are among the most peculiar trees in kind and most astonishing in habit. They look exactly like date palms, without any difference between them except that the one produces nuts as its fruits and the other produces dates. The nut of a coconut tree resembles a man's head, for in it are what look like two eyes and a mouth, and the inside of it, when it is green, looks like the brain, and attached to it in a fiber which look like hair. They make from these cords with which they sew up ships instead of using iron nails, and they also make from it cables for vessels. What are the comparisons the Ibn Battuta makes to give his readers an idea about what coconuts looked like? Do you think these are appropriate? How does he convey a sense that this fruit is unusual? How accurate is his descriptions? Comment this. The coconut and the pan. Some of the best examples of Ibn Battuta's strategies of representations are evident in the ways in which he describes the coconut and the pan, two kinds of plant produce that were completely unfamiliar to his audience. The pan. Read Ibn Battuta's description of the pan. The betel is a tree which is cultivated in the same manner as the grapevine. The betel has no fruit and is grown only for the sake of its leaves. The manner of its use is that before eating it, one takes areca nuts. This is like a nutmeg, but is broken up until it is reduced to small pellets, and one places these in his mouth and chews them. Then he takes the leaves of betel, puts a little chalk on them, and masticates them along with the betel. Why do you think this attracted Ibn Battuta's attention? Is there anything you would like to add to this description? Comment this. Ibn Battuta and Indian cities. Ibn Battuta found cities in the subcontinent full of exciting opportunities for those who had the necessary drive, resource and skill. They were densely populated and prosperous except for the occasional disruptions caused by wars and invasions. It appears from Ibn Battuta's accounts that most cities has crowded streets and bright and colorful markets that were stacked with a wide variety of goods. Ibn Battuta described Delhi as a first city with a great population, the largest in India. Daulatabad in Maharashtra was no less and easily rivaled Delhi in size. What were the architectural features that Ibn Battuta noted? Compare this description with the illustration of the city shown in figure 5.8 and 5.9. Comment this. Delhi. Here is an excerpt from Ibn Battuta's account of Delhi, often spelled as Delhi in text of period. The city of Delhi covers a wide area and has a large population. The rampart round the city is without parallel. The breadth of its wall is 11 cubits, and inside it are houses for the night sentry and gatekeepers. Inside the ramparts, there are storehouses for storing edibles, magazines, ammunition, ballistas, and siege machines. The grains that are stored in these ramparts can last for a long time without rotting. In the interior of the rampart, horsemen as well as infantrymen move from one end of the city to another. The rampart is pierced through by windows which open on the side of the city. It is through these windows that light enters inside. The lower part of the rampart is built of stone, the upper parts of bricks. It has many towers close to one another. There are 28 gates of the city which are called Darwaja. And of these, the Budaun Darwaja is the greatest. Inside the Mandavi Darwaja, there is a grain market. Adjacent to the Gul Darwaja, there is an orchard. The city of Delhi, has a fine cemetery in which graves have domes over them, and those that do not have a dome have an earth for sure in the cemetery. They sow flowers such as tuberose, jasmine, wild rose, and flower blossoms there in all seasons. An arch in Tughlaqabad, Delhi, and the part of the fortification wall of the settlement. The bazaars were not only places of economic transaction but also the hub of social and cultural activities. Most bazaars had a mosque and a temple, and in some of them at least spaces were marked for public performances by dancers, musicians, and singers. While Ibn Battuta was not particularly concerned with explaining the prosperity of towns, historians have used his account to suggest the town derived a significant portion of their wealth through the appropriation of surplus from villages. Ibn Battuta found Indian agriculture very productive because of the fertility of the soil, which allowed farmers to cultivate 2 crops a year. He also noted that the subcontinent was well integrated with inter-Asian networks of trade and commerce, with Indian manufacturers being in great demand in both West Asia and Southeast Asia. Fetching huge profits for artisans and merchants, Indian textile, particularly cotton, clothes, fine muslin, silk, brocade, and satin, were in great demand. Ibn Battuta informed us that certain varieties of fine muslin were so expensive that they could be owned only by the nobles and the very rich. Ikat weaving patterns such as this were adopted and modified in several coastal production centers in the subcontinent and in Southeast Asia. Music in the market. Read Ibn Battuta's description of Daulatabad. In Daulatabad, there is a marketplace for male and female singers, which is known as Tarabad. It is one of the greatest and most beautiful bazaars. It has numerous shops, and every shop has a door which leads into the house of the owner. The shops are decorated with carpets, and at the center of the shop there is a swing on which sits the female singer. She is decked with all kinds of finery, and her female attendant swings her. In the middle of the marketplace there stands a large cupola which is carpeted and decorated, and in which the chief of the musician takes his place every Thursday after his dawn prayer, accompanied by his servant and slaves. The female singers come in successive crowds, sing before him and dance until dusk, after which he withdraw. In the bazaar there are mosques for offering prayers. One of the Hindu rulers alighted at the cupola every time he passed by this marketplace, and the female singers would sing before him. Even some Muslim rulers did the same. Why do you think Ibn Battuta highlighted these activities in his description? Comment this. A unique system of communication. The state eventually took special measures to encourage merchants. Almost all trade routes were well supplied with inns and guest houses. Ibn Battuta was also amazed by the efficiency of the postal system, which allowed merchants to not only send information and remit credit across long distances, but also to dispatch goods required as short notice. The postal system was so efficient that while it took 50 days to reach Delhi from Sindh, the new reports of spaces and would reach the Sultan through the postal system in just 5 days. On horse and on foot. This is how Ibn Battuta described the postal system. In India, the postal system is of two kinds. The horse post, called Uluk, is run by royal horses stationed at a distance of every 4 miles. The foot post has 3 stations per mile. It is called Dawa, that is 1/3 of a mile. Now at every third of a mile here is a well-populated village, outside which are 3 pavilions in which sit men with girded loins ready to start. Each of them carries a rod 2 cubits in length with copper bells at the top. When the courier starts from the city, he holds the letter in one hand and the rod with his bells on the other, and he runs as fast as he can. When the men in pavilion hear the ringing of the bell, they get ready as soon as the courier reaches them. One of them takes the letter from his hands and runs at top speed, shaking the rod all the while until he reaches the next dawa. And the same process continues till the letter reaches its destination. This foot post is quicker than the horse post, and often it is used to transport the fruits of Khurasan, which are much desired in India. Do you think the foot post system could have operated throughout the subcontinent? Comment this. Discuss. How did Ibn Battuta handle the problem of describing things or situations to people who had not seen or experienced them? Comment this. Strange nations. The Travelogue of Abdul Razzaq, written in 1440s, is an interesting mixture of emotions and perceptions. On the one hand, he did not appreciate what he saw in the port of Calicut, present-day Kozhikode, in Kerala, which was populated by a people the likes of whom I had never imagined, describing them as strange nation. Later, in his visit to India, he arrived in Mangalore and crossed the Western Ghats. Here he saw a temple that filled him with admiration. Within 3 leagues, about 9 miles of Mangalore, I saw an idol house, the like of which is not to be found in all the world. It was a square, approximately 10 yards in height, 5 yards in height, all covered with cast bronze, with 4 porticos. In the entrance portico was a statue in the likeness of a human being, full stature, made of gold. It had 2 red rubies for eyes, so cunningly made that you would say it could see. What crafts and artisanship! Discuss. How did Ibn Battuta handle the problem of describing things or situations to people who had not seen or experienced them? Comment this. Bernier and the Degenerate East. If Ibn Battuta chose to describe everything that impressed and excited him because of its novelty, Francis Bernier belonged to a different intellectual tradition. He was far more preoccupied with comparing and contrasting what he saw in India with the situation in Europe in general and France in particular, focusing on situations which he considered depressing. His idea seems to have been to influence policymakers and the intelligentsia to ensure that they made what he considered to be right decisions. Burnier's travels in the Mughal Empire is marked by detailed observation, critical insights, and reflection. His accounts contain discussion trying to place the history of the Mughal within some sort of universal framework. He constantly compared Mughal India with contemporary Europe, generally emphasizing the superiority of the latter. His representation of India works on the model of binary opposition, where India is presented as the inverse of Europe. He also adhered the perceived differences hierarchically, so that India appeared to be inferior to the Western world. Widespread poverty. Pelser, a Dutch traveler, visited the subcontinent during the early decades of the 17th century. Like Bernier, he was shocked to see the widespread poverty. Poverty so great and miserable that the life of the people can be depicted or accurately described only as the home of stark want and the dwelling place of bitter woe. Holding the state responsible, he says, so much is wrong from the peasant that even dry bread is scarcely left to fill their stomach. The questions of land ownership. According to Bernier, one of the fundamental differences between Mughal India and Europe was the lack of private property and in land in the former. He was a firm believer in the virtues of private property and saw crown ownership of land as being harmful for both the state and its people. He thought that the Mughal Empire, the emperor owned all the land and distributed it among his nobles, and that this had disastrous consequences for the economy and society. This perception was not unique to Bernier, but found in most travelers' accounts of the 16th and 17th century. Owing to crown ownership of land, argued Bernier, landholders could not pass on their land to their children, so they were adverse to any long-term investment in the sustenance and expansion of production. The absence of private property in land had therefore prevented the emergence of the class of improving landlords, as in Western Europe. Within a concern to maintain or improve the land, it had led to the uniform reunions of agriculture, excessive production of the peasantry, and a continuous decline in the living standards of all sections of society, except the ruling aristocracy. The poor peasant. An excerpt from Burnier's description of the peasantry in the countryside of the vast tracts of country constituting the empire of Hindustan. Many were little more than sand or barren mountains, badly cultivated and thinly populated. Even a considerable portion of the good land remains untilled for want of laborers, many of whom perish in consequence of the bad treatment they experience from governors. The poor people, when they become incapable of discharging the demands of their rapacious lords, are not only often deprived of the means of subsistence, but are also made to lose the children who are carried away as slaves. Thus it happens that the peasantry, driven to despair by so excessive a tyranny, abandoned the country. In this instance, Bernier was participating in contemporary debates in Europe concerning the nature of state and society. and intended that his description of Mughal India would serve as a warning to those who did not recognize the merits of private property. What, according to Barnier, were the problems faced by peasants in the subcontinent? Do you think his description would have served to strengthen this case? Comment this. Drawings such as the 19th century example often reinforce the notions of an unchanging rural society. And as an extension of this, Barnier described Indian society as consisting of undifferentiated masses of impoverished people subjugated by a small minority of a very rich and powerful ruling class, between the poorest of the poor and the richest of the rich. There was no social group or class or the name. Barnier confidently asserted there is no middle state in India. A warning for Europe. Barnier warned that if European kings followed the Mughal model, their kingdoms would be very far from being well cultivated and peopled, so well built, so rich, so polite, and flourished as we see them. Our kings are otherwise rich and powerful, and we must avow that they are much better and more royally served. They would soon be kings of deserts and solitude, of beggars and barbarians, such as those are whom I have been representing the Mughals. We should find the great cities and the great boroughs rendered uninhabitable because of ill air and to fall to ruin without anybody taking care of repairing them, the hillocks abandoned and the field overspread with bushes or filled with pestilential marshes, as has been already intimated. How does Barnier depict a scenario of doom? Once you have read chapter 8 and 9, return to this description and analyze it again. Comment this. This then is how Barnier saw the Mughal Empire. Its king was the king of beggars and barbarians. Its cities and towns are ruined and contaminated with ill air, and its fields overspread with bushes, and full of pestilential matrices. And all this was because of one reason: crown ownership of land. Curiously, none of the Mughal official documents suggest that the state was the sole owner of land. For instance, Abul Fazl, the 16th century official chronicles of Akbar's reign, describe the land revenue as remunerations of sovereignty, a claim made by the ruler on his subjects for the protection he provided rather than as rent or land that he owned. It is possible that European travelers regarded such claims as rent because land revenue demands are often very high. However, this was actually not a rent or even a land tax, but a tax on the crop. For more details, see chapter 8. Barnier's description influenced Western theories from the 18th century onward. The French philosopher Montesquieu, for instance, used this account to develop the idea of Oriental despotism, according to which rulers in Asia, the Orient or the East, enjoyed absolute authority over their subjects, who were kept in conditions of subjugation and poverty, arguing that all land belonged to the king and that private property was non-existent. According to this view, everybody except the emperor and his nobles barely managed to survive. This idea was further developed as the concept of the Asiatic mode of the production by Karl Marx in the 19th century. He argued that in India and the Asian countries before colonialism, surpluses was appropriated by the state. This led to the emergence of a society that was composed of a large number of autonomous and internally egalitarian village communities. The imperial code presides over these village communities, respecting their autonomy as long as the flow of supplies was unimpeded. This was regarded as a stagnant system. However, as we will see, this picture of rural societies was far from true. In fact, during the 16th and 17th centuries, rural societies was characterized by considerable social and economic differentiations. At one end of the spectrum were the big zamindars, who enjoyed superior rights in the land, and all the others, the untouchable landless. Laborers in between was the big peasant who used hired labor and engaged in commodity production, and the smaller peasant who could barely produce for his subsistence. A more complex social reality. While Barnier's preoccupations with projecting the Mughal state as tyrannical and obvious, his description occasionally hint at a more complex social reality. For instance, he felt that artisans had no incentive to improve the quality of their manufacture, since profits were appropriated by the states. Manufactures were consequently everywhere in decline. At the same time, he considered the vast quantities of the world's precious metals flowed into India, as manufactures were exported in exchange for gold and silver. He also noticed the existence of a prosperous merchant community engaged in long-distance exchange. A different socio-economic scenario. Read this excerpt from Barnier's description of both agriculture and crop production. It is important to observe that of this vast tract of country, a large portion is extremely fertile. The large kingdom of Bengal, for instance, surpassing Egypt itself, not only in the production of rice, corn, and other necessaries of life, but of innumerable articles of commerce which are not cultivated in Egypt, such as silk, cotton, and indigo. There are also many parts of the Indies where the population is sufficiently abundant and the land pretty well tilled, and where the artisan, although naturally indolent, is yet compelled by necessity or otherwise to employ himself in manufacturing carpets, brocades, and embroiders, gold and silver clothes, and the various sorts of silk and cotton goods, which are used in a country or exported abroad. It should not escape notice that gold and silver, after circulating in every other quarter of the globe, come at length to be swallowed up, lost in some measure in Hindustan. In what ways is the description in this excerpt different from that is source 11? Come in this. A gold spoon studded with emeralds and rubies, an example of dexterity of Mughal artisan. The imperial Karkhanas. Barnier is perhaps the only historian who provides a detailed account of the working of the imperial Karkhanas, or workshops. Large halls are seen at many places called karkhanas or workshops for the artisans. In one hall, embroiderers are busily employed, superintended by a master. In another, you see the goldsmith. In a third, painters. in a fourth burnishers in lacquer work, in fifth joiners, turners, tailors and shoemakers, in a sixth manufacturers of silk, brocade and fine muslin. The artisans come every morning to their karkhanas, where they remain employed the whole day and in the evening return to their homes. In this quiet, regular manner, their time gilds away, no one aspiring for any improvement in the condition of life wherein he happens to be born. How does Barnier convey a sense that although there was a great deal of activity, there was a little progress? Comment this. In fact, during the 17th century, about 15% of the population lived in towns. This was, on average, higher than the proportion of urban population in Western Europe in the same period. In spite of this, Barnard described Mughal cities as camp towns, by which he meant towns that owned their existence and depended for the survival on the imperial camp. He believed that this came into existence when the imperial court moved in and rapidly declined when it moved out. He suggested that they did not have viable social and economic foundations but were dependent on imperial patronage. As in the case of the question of land ownership, Barnier was drawing an oversimplified picture. There were all kinds of towns, manufacturing towns, trading towns, port towns, care center, pilgrimage towns, etc. Their existence is an index of the prosperity of merchant communities and professional classes. Merchants often had strong community or kin ties and were organized into their own caste-cum occupational bodies. In Western India, these groups were called Mahajanas, and their chief, the Sheth. In urban centers such as Ahmedabad, the Mahajan was collectively represented by the chief of the merchant community, who was called the Nagar Sheth. Other urban groups included professional classes such as physician, hakim or vaid, teachers, pandits and mullah, lawyers, wakil, painters, architects, musicians, calligraphers, etc., while some depended on imperial patronage. Many made their living by serving other patrons, while still others served ordinary people in crowded market or bazaar. Discuss why do you think scholars like Barnard choose to compare India with Europe? Comment this. 7. Women, slaves, shoti and laborers. Slave women. Even Battuta informs us it is the habit of the emperor to keep with every noble, great or small, one of his slaves who spies on the nobles. He also appoints female scavengers who enter the houses unannounced, and to them the slave girls communicate all the information they possess. Most female slaves were captured in raids and expectations. The child Shati. This is perhaps one of the most poignant descriptions by Barnier. At Lahore, I saw a most beautiful young widow sacrificed, who could not, I think, have been more than 12 years of age. The poor little creature appeared more dead than alive. When she approached the dreadful pit, the agony of her mind cannot be described. She trembled and wept bitterly. But 3 or 4 of the Brahmanas, assisted by an old woman who held her under the arm, forced the unwilling victim toward the fatal spot, seated her on the wood, tied her hands and feet lest she should run away. And in the situation, the innocent creature was burnt alive. I found it difficult to repress my feelings and to prevent their bursting forth into clamorous and unavailing rage. Travelers who left written accounts are generally men who were interested in and sometimes intrigued by the condition of women in the subcontinent. Sometimes they took social inequities for granted as a natural state of affairs. For instance, slaves were openly sold in market like any other commodity and were regularly exchanged as gifts. When Ibn Battuta is seen the purchase horses, camels and slaves as gift for Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq. When he reached Multan, he presented the governor with a slave and horse together with raisins and almonds. Muhammad bin Tughlaq informed Ibn Battuta was so happy with the sermon of a preacher named Nasiruddin that he gave him 100,000 tankas coins and 200 slaves. It appears from Ibn Battuta's account that there was considerable differentiation among slaves. Some female slaves in the service of the Sultan were expert in music and dance, and Ibn Battuta enjoyed their performance at the wedding of the Sultan's sister. Female slaves were also employed by the Sultan to keep a watch on his nobles. Slaves were generally used for domestic labor, and Ibn Battuta found their services particularly indispensable for carrying women and men and palanquins or dola. The price of slaves, particularly female slaves required for domestic labor, was very low, and most families which could afford to do so kept at least one or two of them. Contemporary European travelers and writers often highlighted the treatment of women as a crucial markers of difference between Western and Eastern societies. Not surprisingly, Burness closed the practice of sati for detailed description. He noted that while some women seemed to embrace death cheerfully, others were forced to die. However, women's lives revolved around much else besides the practice of sati. Their labor was crucial in both agricultural and non-agricultural production. Women from merchant families participated in commercial activities, sometimes even taking mercantile disputes to the court of law. It therefore seems unlikely that women were confined to the private spaces of their home. Discuss. Why do you think the lives of ordinary women workers did not attract the attention of the traveler such as Ibn Battuta and Burner? Comment this. You may have noticed that travelers' accounts provide us with a tantalizing glimpse of the lives of men and women during these centuries. However, their observations were often shaped by the context from which they came. At the same time, there were many aspects of social life that the travelers did not notice. Also relatively unknown are the experience and observation of men and possibly women from the subcontinent who crossed seas and mountains and ventured into lands beyond the subcontinent. What did they see and hear? How were their relations with peoples of distant lands shaped? What were the languages they used? These and other questions will hopefully be systematically addressed by historians in the years to come. A sculptured panel from Mathura depicting travelers. What are the various modes of transport that are shown? Comment this. Timeline. Some travelers who left accounts 10th, 11th centuries, 973 to 1048. Muhammad ibn Ahmad Abun Rayyan al-Biruni from Uzbekistan, 13th century, 1254 to 1323. Marco Polo from Italy. 14th century 1304 to 77 Ibn Battuta from Morocco. 15th century 1413 to 82 Abd al-Razzaq Kamal al-Din ibn Ishaq al-Samarkandi from Samarkand. 1466 to 72 years spent in India. Afanasy Nikitin, 15th century from Russia. 16th century 1518 visit to India. Dorte Barbosa, 1521 from Portugal. 1562 year of death. Saidi Ali Reis from Turkey. 1536 to 1600 Antonio Monserrato from Spain. 17th century 1626 to 31 Muhammad Wali Balkhi from Balkh. 1600 to 67 Peter Mundy from England. 1605 to 89 Jean-Baptiste Tavernier from France. 1620 to 88 Francois Bernier from France. Unless otherwise indicated, the dates mentioned are those of the lifespan of the traveler. Answer in 100 to 150 words. Write a short essay about 250 to 300 words on the following: map work, project, choose one. Interview any one of your older relatives, mother, father, grandparents, uncles, aunts, who have traveled outside your town or village. Find out where they went, how they traveled, how long did it take, why did they travel, and did they face any difficulties. List as many similarities and differences that they may have noticed between their place of residence and the place they visited, focusing on language, clothes, food, customs, buildings, roads, the lives of men and women. Write a report on your finding. Comment this. 12. For any one of the travelers mentioned in the chapter, find out more about his life and writings. Prepare a report on his travels, noting in particular how he describes society and comparing these descriptions with the excerpt included in the chapter. Comment this. A painting depicting travelers at rest.